Now at 6 o'clock, the BBC News on BBC One with George Alagaya.
A remarkable life remembered. Baroness Thatcher's funeral service at St Paul's Cathedral. She was Britain's longest-serving Prime Minister for more than a century and the only woman to hold the office. The Queen attended the service, the first time she's done that since Winston Churchill's funeral. More than 2,000 guests from home and abroad paid their respects to a leader who presided over challenging times.
After the storm of a life lived in the heat of political controversy, there is a great calm.
Thousands lined the streets of central London. Some protested, but the majority came to pay respect. We'll hear from people right around the country, also tonight. Investigators in Boston revealed the first clues to the marathon attack. These fragments might have been parts of the bomb. Unemployment rises by 70,000. It's the second month in a row that it's increased. Tesco, the giant of the high street, has a fall in profits for the first time in nearly 20 years.
Tonight, a special programme live from St Paul's Cathedral. We'll hear from the Londoners who knew Baroness Thatcher and report from Canary Wharf on what may be her most significant legacy to London.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. The funeral service for Baroness Thatcher has taken place at St Paul's Cathedral. It was attended by the Queen and all those politicians, Labour and Conservative, who followed her into Downing Street as Prime Minister. Earlier, her coffin was placed on a gun carriage and taken through central London. First tonight, our political editor Nick Robinson reports on the service and those who came to remember Margaret Thatcher, the dominant political figure of her age.
They didn't stop all the clocks. They did, though, silence Big Ben. They did cancel Prime Minister's questions. They did pause the political debate. All marks of respect for the funeral of Britain's only woman Prime Minister, the longest serving in 150 years. The crowds lining Whitehall applauded. Their reply, perhaps, to those who protested against Margaret Thatcher even after death. She was driven past Downing Street for one last time. Her journey would be marked by the sounds of guns, last fired in anger in the battle to retake the Falklands. At St Paul's Cathedral, the great and the good and the merely famous arrived to pay their respects. Heads of state, Prime Ministers, Foreign Ministers, representatives of 170 countries. There too, her successors and those who dream of succeeding her. Britain will never see another like Margaret Thatcher. Britain may never see another funeral quite like this one. Not at least for a politician, rather than a member of the royal family. The coffin of the woman whose leadership was forged in war was transferred to a gun carriage. The route lined by officers wearing black armbands, rifle muzzles pointed down as a mark of respect. The presence of Her Majesty the Queen, the final honour extended to no other Prime Minister since the death of Winston Churchill. The police were ready for anyone who might want to protest that all this was too much, too expensive, too respectful. In fact, few here did protest. The sound of half-muffled bells greeted the arrival of the coffin at the steps of St Paul's. Its bearers from units of the Army, Navy and Air Force, which had fought in the South Atlantic. This was a funeral not just for a public figure, but for a grandmother and a mother. Carol Thatcher and her brother Mark watched as his daughter Amanda read from the Bible what sounded to some like a rather Thatcherite message.
Stand, therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness.
The Prime Minister's reading also contained a message of moral certainty.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me.
This was not a moment for speeches, save one, the sermon of a family friend, the Bishop of London, who said that the parson shouldn't make the sort of judgments which politicians should make.
After the storm of a life lived in the heat of political controversy, there is a great calm. The storm of conflicting opinions centres on the Mrs. Thatcher, who became a symbolic figure, even an ism. But today, the remains of the real Margaret Hilda Thatcher are here at her funeral service. Lying here, she is one of us.
One of us, a Thatcher phrase for those she saw as being on her side. The real woman was, he suggested, different from the mythological Thatcher, whose saying there's no such thing as society had been misunderstood.
And as she said, the great truth that we do not achieve happiness or salvation in isolation from each other, but as members of society. Her later remark about there being no such thing as society has been misunderstood and refers, in her mind, to some impersonal entity to which we are tempted to surrender our independence.
All this enough to move George Osborne. The Chancellor sat, eyes blinking, a tear clearly visible on his cheek. Later he tweeted, "It was an almost overwhelming day." It was quite a send-off for the grocer's daughter from Grantham. It was the funeral she wanted, the one she discussed, not just with David Cameron's government, but with Tony Blair's and Gordon Brown's too. And after all the ceremony, all the debate, all the emotion, it ended as few would have predicted, with the cheers of Margaret Thatcher's supporters. Nick Robinson, BBC News, St Paul's Cathedral.
As we've seen, thousands lined the streets as the funeral cortege passed through central London. Many had travelled from around the UK to be there. There were some protests, but the majority of people in the crowd simply wanted to pay their respects to Baroness Thatcher, as John Kay reports.
From first light, they gathered in their thousands. Each had their own reason for coming and their own way of showing it.
Obviously Margaret Thatcher, Lady in Blue. I think this is a fitting, sort of dignified tribute to her.
I've got dozens and dozens of photographs, actually.
Christine Cowling told me she'd travelled here overnight from Cornwall. She used to cut Margaret Thatcher's hair when the Prime Minister was on holiday.
I feel very privileged to have met her, and I'm delighted to be here to pay my last respects to her.
By the time the cortege came past, the crowd was 10 deep in places, office workers and tourists joining the mourners, many of them applauding Britain's first woman Prime Minister.